Alright, here's a video going into an example of using production possibilities frontiers and the idea of opportunity cost to discuss principles involved with international trade. Now, this is illustrating the idea of why do countries trade with each other anyway. It's not necessarily because one country does something better than another. That could be why you trade with somebody. But even you want to trade with people, even if you if you are a better producer of a good than that other country in everything. So even if a country is better, and we'll talk about what better means, is better at producing everything than another country, still it doesn't mean that they would not benefit from trading with that other country. So let's look at an example here to get us started. So let's use as an example the adult beverage industry. And let's suppose that there are two countries, to keep things simple. We'll look at two countries in the United States and France. And let's suppose in the United States, just to keep this example simple, we have 100 people who work in this industry, in this beverage industry, and same thing in France. But in these two countries, people have different relative strengths. So let's suppose in the United States that, sorry, I moved that there. Let's suppose that in the United States there are people that have these kinds of skills. One of these workers can either spend their day making 4 barrels of beer or 2 barrels of wine. Now in France, one worker can either make 1 barrel of beer or 4 barrels of wine. So let's first explore this situation by drawing the production possibilities frontiers for France and the United States. Let's start off by looking at France, and I'll use red for France. Now over here I have an X and Y axes, beer on the X axis, and Y axis we'll put wine. So let's look at France. They have 100 workers, and let's suppose, to start off with, that all workers make beer in France. What are we going to be talking about? Well, in France, if all 100 workers make 1 barrel of beer each, we'll have 100 barrels of beer. So let's mark off the axis here. How about we do these little tick marks in 50s? So that'll be 0 over here, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300. And for France, we don't even need to go that far, because if all 100 workers are making beer, then in France they will end up with only 100 barrels of beer. So that's that point right there. They would have no wine and 100 beer. Now, what if they went to the other extreme and France decided to take all of their 100 workers and make nothing but wine? How many could they make? Well, let me label the axis here. So that's 50, 100, 150, 200, 300. So every 2 tick marks will be 100 here. And we could go up, say one more, 400, 500. Okay. So how many will they end up with? Well, 100 workers making 4 barrels of wine apiece will be 400. So we have these 2 points, 400 barrels of wine and no beer, or no wine and 100 units of beer. Now, in order to make a production possibilities frontier here, since we're assuming that these are the same skills, same kind of equipment used to make beer and wine. I know they're slightly different. And what we're assuming here is that each worker we can transfer between these two industries at the same, and have the same kind of trade-off, constant slope on this production possibilities frontier. That's why I made this assumption about the same skills and equipment. So what we can do is we can just connect these 2 points here. Let me try to do this here with a straight line. And that straight line is going to be the production possibilities frontier for France. Now, what does the slope of that line mean? Well, what the slope is going to tell us here, let me zoom in here real quickly so we can see this slightly better. What this slope is telling us that is, if we start off at this point here where we're making no beer and 400 wine, that if we wanted to produce a barrel of beer, that what we're going to have to do to produce that barrel of beer, we're going over 1. We're going to have to go down 4 times as much. So basically every time you go over 1 unit, you have to go down 1, 2, 3, 4 units. That represents the trade-off faced by France, that each beer costs them 4 units of wine that they have to give up. So that's in what sense we're talking about it being an opportunity cost here. So let's draw the production possibilities frontier for the United States. In the U.S., each worker can make 4 barrels of beer or 2 barrels of wine. All right, well, let's go over here and draw that. If all 100 workers make beer, then we'll use blue here for the United States. Then 100 workers making 4 barrels of beer apiece, they'll be over here at 400 barrels of beer if they send no workers to produce wine. However, what if all those 100 workers made wine? Well, 2 barrels per day times 100 workers would be 200 barrels of wine. And if we connect those 2 dots, we will have the production possibilities frontier for the United States. So let me connect those here. All right. So again, we're assuming this is a straight line because we're assuming that there is a constant opportunity cost, because as we shift workers between these 2 extremes, we're making the assumption, it's a pretty strong assumption, probably not realistic, that all these workers who are just as good at making beer and at making wine, and same thing with the other resources that are needed to produce these products. So if you look at the slope of this line, the slope here tells us about the opportunity cost of making beer and wine in the United States. Now for France, what we said was that each time they want to make a unit of beer, the slope of this line is -4, and that slope of -4 means for France that they have to give up 4 wine for each beer. So that tells us about their opportunity cost. 4 W's for each 1 B. Let's look at the United States. What's their opportunity cost if they want another beer? Well, the slope of this line is -1/2. Now, how do I know that? Well, between these 2 blue points, the rise is -200, the run is 400, and slope is rise over run, so 200 over 400 is 1/2. But since that's down 200, the slope here is -1/2. And so the slope of this production possibilities frontier for the U.S. says that when we want a beer, we have to give up 1/2 of a wine. So give up 1/2 of a wine per beer that we want to get. So that's one way of calculating the opportunity cost. As we move in this direction, producing more beer, for each beer we get, we give up 1/2 of a wine if you're U.S. Now this is much steeper for France. They have to give up 4 wine for each beer they get. Now we could also calculate this opportunity cost going in the opposite direction. And when you do it in the other direction, so what we're doing here is calculating the opportunity cost of each beer. If you want to calculate the opportunity cost of going the other direction and producing more wine, you just look at the reciprocal of these slopes, 1 over those slopes. So the opportunity cost for France, if they started over here somewhere and they wanted to move in that direction and produce more wine, how much does each wine cost them? How many beers do they have to give up to get each wine? Well, for France, that answer would be 1/4. They have to give up 1/4 of a beer per wine. It's just the reciprocal. If it's 4 wines for each beer, it's 1/4 of a wine. 1/4 of a beer for each wine. And similarly here for the United States, the reciprocal of that would be 2. So that means that if we were not trading, and in the United States we were stuck on this production possibilities frontier, we would have to give up 2 beer for each wine we got. 2 beers for each wine. So 2 beer per wine. So that's how you do the opportunity cost if you've watched the other video. Now, here I ask what's the equation of the production possibilities frontier. So we could do that. So we already looked at the slope. The slope of the production possibilities frontier for France was -4. The slope of the PPF for the United States was -1/2. And to write the equation, all you need to do is bring in the y-intercept here. So the y-intercept for the line for France is 400. So we could write this equation this way for France. We could say that the amount of wine, let me see here, that for France the amount of wine is equal to 400 minus 4, that's the slope, times the amount of beer. That's an equation that expresses this relationship for France. What about the United States? Well, for the United States, the amount of wine they can produce is equal to, let's look at the y-intercept over here, 200 minus 1/2 times the amount of beer that they produce. And so you can see that opportunity cost in the relationship here. If you want 1 more beer, if beer goes up by 1, the amount of wine has to go down by 1/2. And we could solve this for an equation in terms of beer, and that's where the reciprocal cost comes in. So, in question 3 here, in the U.S., what's the opportunity to cost to produce a barrel of beer? Well, if you produce another beer, you give up, that's what we were already talking about, 1/2 of a wine. What's the opportunity cost to produce another barrel of wine? 2 beer. It's just the reciprocal. In France, the opportunity cost to produce a barrel of beer is 4 wine. To produce a barrel of wine, 1/4 of a barrel of beer. Okay, so when you're talking about opportunity costs and production possibilities, frontiers, and trade, here are the 2 most important definitions. When we talk about whether you want to trade with somebody or whether you're better than somebody else at doing something, we ask the question, do you have an absolute advantage in doing something? Now, you have an absolute advantage in something if you can do it with fewer resources. Or, a flip side way to think about that is, you are more productive. It takes less time or workers to produce the same amount of units. So if you're better at something, that's really what we usually mean by the term better In everyday English, you mean you have an absolute advantage. You are faster, you're more productive, you can do it more cheaply, or in other words, one worker can produce more than some worker in another country. On the other hand, in economics, there's another way that we usually talk about whether somebody's better than someone else, and that is the idea of a comparative advantage. It's not whether you're more productive, but it's whether, compared to another country, you can do it for a lower opportunity cost. So it's not really how much your workers are producing per hour or anything like that, or per day. It's how much do you give up when you produce something? What's your opportunity cost, in other words? So let's talk about this example very precisely in precise terms here. Question: who has an absolute advantage in beer? Who's better at producing beer? Well, the United States is better at producing beer because in the U.S., one worker can make 4 barrels of beer a day, but in France, only 1 barrel of beer a day. So the U.S. has an absolute advantage. We're better at making beer than people in France. We can do it faster, or workers can produce more than they can in France per worker. In wine, how about an absolute advantage? Well, France, in this example, can make 4 barrels of wine a day compared to only 2 per day in the U.S. So, France. Now, it could be the case that the United States was better at both, or France was better at both. So, there's no reason why one country has to have an absolute advantage in one but not the other. It just so happens that's the case here. Now, what about a comparative advantage? Here we're looking at the opportunity costs. So what we're asking again is, you have a comparative advantage if you can do it with a smaller opportunity cost. You give up less than someone else when you produce this good. So when I ask who has a comparative advantage in making beer, I'm asking, when you make beer, whose opportunity cost is lowest? Well, let's compare. In the U.S., what's the opportunity cost to make a barrel of beer? 1/2 of a barrel of wine. In France, what's the opportunity cost to produce 1 barrel of beer? 4 wine. What this means is every time a worker in the U.S. chooses to make beer, we're only losing 1/2 of a barrel of wine. But if somebody in France decides to make a barrel of beer, the world is losing out on 4 barrels of wine. So if you had to choose who should make the beer, should it be somebody who, if they make beer, will not have the opportunity to make 1/2 of a barrel of wine? Or is it someone who will not have the opportunity to instead make 4 barrels of wine? Well, it's cheaper here for the person in the U.S. to make beer because we lose less wine production. That's the idea of a comparative advantage. Who has a comparative advantage in making wine? Well, it turns out to be France. Don't be fooled, though. The fact that the U.S. has an absolute advantage in beer does not necessarily mean we'll have a comparative advantage in beer, okay? And you're going to have a homework problem where this is not the case. But France has the comparative advantage in wine. Why? Well, their opportunity cost is less. So let's look. Let me erase some of these lines here. So in the U.S., for somebody to make a barrel of wine, we would give up making 2 barrels of beer. But if the people in France make wine, they only give up 1/4 of a barrel of beer. So who has the comparative advantage? France. But don't guess that it's the same thing as who has the absolute advantage, right? Make sure you consult these definitions and you understand why this is true. So, what's the point? Well, let's try to get to the punchline here. Um, Suppose we don't trade, and we each use half of our workers to produce each product. How much beer and wine will we have? So what I'm saying here is, let's suppose that in the United States, what we decide to do, in both countries, we're going to take 50 workers, and they're going to make wine. And 50 workers will make beer. Then, so that's how we're splitting our labor force. How much wine will we end up with? Well, one worker can make 2 barrels of wine. So that's going to be 100 barrels of wine. 50 people making beer. These 50 guys can each make 4 barrels of beer apiece, so we're going to end up with 200 beer. Okay? Now in France, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to split their workforce evenly. They don't have to, but let's just suppose. Then they're going to take their 50 workers. How many wines can 50 workers make in France? Let's see. 4 barrels times 50 is 200 wine. And 50 workers in France can make 50 barrels of beer. Now, what I like to do at this point is total. In the world, how much do we have to drink? Well, we're going to have 100 wine in the U.S., 200 in France, 300 wine. And in the U.S., we're going to make 200 beer. In France, they'll make 50. We're going to end up with 250 beer. So this is the world total production here. Now I want to show you what's going to happen if they specialize. Now, countries should specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in and then trade. So let's suppose that they specialize. Let's see what the world output would be, and then let's try to figure out how they might trade. So suppose they specialize. What's going to happen is the United States has a comparative advantage in beer. So we would say, U.S., all your workers should make beer. So what we're going to end up with is the United States is going to be at that point. All beer, no wine. France is going to be at that point. All wine and no beer. So how much world output will we end up with? Well, instead of 300 wine and 250 beer, somehow, miraculously, we would end up with the United States makes 400 beer and France makes 400 wine. This is how trade can make both nations better off. But we just have to figure out now, we have more stuff, more wine and beer total, but all the beer happens to be in the U.S. and all the wine happens to be in France. Now we have to figure out a way to trade. So, last question here. What would be a fair trading price we could use where both countries would benefit? Here you just have to keep in mind that neither country would be willing to give up more. In other words, pay more. Instead of paying in dollars, we're going to be paying in beer or paying in wine. So the United States has beer, and we want to take that beer and use it to pay for wine in France. Same thing in France, except they have wine. That's what they're going to use as currency. And they're going to pay us some wine in exchange for some beer. So what would they be willing to give up? Well, they're not going to be willing to pay more than they could do by producing it themselves. So let's see. In the United States, how much do we have to pay in the U.S. to produce a barrel of wine? Well, what we have to pay is 2 beer. So we're willing to trade beer for wine with France as long as we don't have to pay 2 beers, maybe less than 2 beers, to get each barrel of wine. Because if they try to charge us 2 beers or 3 beers per wine, we're going to say, no, we can do that ourselves. Forget it. We'll save the shipping costs. So 1 beer per barrel of wine would work for the U.S. Now let's think about France. France has wine. They want to buy beer with wine. How much would they be willing to trade to get a beer? Well, what if they produced their own beer? What is the cost for France to produce a barrel of beer themselves? Well, they would have to give up 4 barrels of wine. So how much could the United States charge them for beer? Well, they couldn't charge them 5 barrels of wine to trade for 1 barrel of beer, but they could charge 3 barrels of beer, or 2 barrels of beer, or 1 barrel of beer for wine. So when you come up with a fair trade price, these things naturally work themselves out in the marketplace, but this is just to get you to see what kinds of prices might work for each country. So in this case, the United States would not be willing to pay more than 2 beers, 2 barrels of beer per wine. They would be willing to trade at 1.5 barrels of beer for a barrel of wine, or 1 barrel of beer for a barrel of wine. France would not be willing to pay more than 4 wine to get a barrel of beer. They would be willing to pay 3 or 2 or 1. Let's just suppose that they decided to trade 1 for 1. That'd be a simple outcome. So a fair trading price that would work would be 1 for 1. That's not necessarily what would happen, but that is one possibility. 1 for 1 would work. Now, what kind of trades might we expect to happen? It depends. We don't really know. We're not sure how much people in the United States like wine versus beer, and same thing in France. But we can show pretty easily that both countries could be better off than what happens if they don't trade, because if they don't trade, this is as well as they could do. But if they traded 1 for 1, then in the United States, suppose we traded half of our beer for wine. Then in the United States, we would end up with 200 beer and 200 wine. We'd be better off. We'd be happy. In France, they could take their 400 wine, trade half of it to us for beer, and then they could end up with still having 200 wine and 200 beer, and they would be better off than if they didn't trade. So this is just a quick, very simplistic example about how you can take information about the relative productivities of people in 2 countries. You can use the number of workers that they have and make production possibilities frontiers. Then we can calculate opportunity costs and determine who would have a comparative advantage, and therefore who should specialize in a certain product. And then we demonstrated how by specializing and by trading, both countries could be better off than they were without trading. International trade, where countries have different opportunity costs, and just about all countries have different opportunity costs and thus have some way that they could specialize in trade. This is one of the things that all economists agree on. Let me just mention one of the downsides though. When you specialize and you trade, in the long run, everybody's going to be better off because people have more goods. Let's talk about the short run though. In the short run, if all of a sudden we go from the situation where people aren't trading here to specializing in trading, there is going to be some short-run problems where people in these countries are going to be mad. Suppose you were one of these wine workers in the United States. well, you're going to lose your job. You're going to be forced to retrain for a new industry. You might have to move from California, where we were making wine, to North Carolina and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we make the beer. And you're going to be upset about that, and you're going to be right to be upset about that. No questions. I agree that there are going to be some problems where this is true. Same thing in France. These people who make beer in France, they're going to be mad that they have to, maybe they're going to lose their business that they've built up for years. They're going to go bankrupt when this cheap United States beer starts flooding the market. I agree. It's going to mean some short-term pain. However, in the long run, trade is something that makes both countries better off. Now, every country has these pains when you start to trade. And there's a lot of concern now about people in the United States who are trading with China. You know, most of your socks, underwear, a lot of your toys, a lot of furniture, these things used to be made in North Carolina, used to be made in the United States. But now we're trading with Mexico, Canada, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, and they're making a lot of those products there. The cost is people are losing their jobs. The benefit is that the people who buy these products, we can buy them a lot more cheaply, and we can get a lot more for our money than we could when we used to produce all these things domestically. Those people that get displaced out of their jobs have a right to be upset. But hopefully we can help them to retrain, help them to get jobs where they can be more productive, at least in a comparative advantage sort of sense. So when we trade those products that those people are making now with other countries, we can get more for them than if we tried to produce everything here. So I'll end this video now. I know it's getting pretty long, but I wanted to cover all that information for you. So let me know if you have any questions. Signing out.